right, hello and welcome to another expert interview. And today I'm delighted to be joined by John Flannery from Drive Revenue, who is actually just down the road from me in San Diego. We could probably have done this in a coffee shop nearby.
Hey, John, good to be here. Thanks for including me.
Yeah, absolutely. And John has been working with sales teams for a long, long time, consulting with big companies across the globe. But John always seems to be in some exotic location doing an event or whatever with training sessions with large companies. But today, as I said, he's in San Diego. And what I wanted to talk to you today about, John, is sales process, right? But you have written and talked a lot about how sales process follows from sales strategy. It's not
Yes.
something that you just create out of thin air yourself, right?
Yes. Yeah, we don't stand alone in the creation of sales process, John. It's just simply not possible. The customers that we work with, varying in size and, as you mentioned, location, they've got to have a developed commercial strategy, their go-to-market strategy on the markets that they're going to be calling in, how they're positioning their products and services, the what as it pertains to what they're asking their sales teams to do before we come in and speak specifically to the how. How are they going to go after and develop opportunities?
So why is it that a lot of organizations seem to, I would say, kind of pay lip service a little bit to sales strategy or gloss over it, or maybe they get together around December and say, well, we better figure out our sales strategy for next year, but they don't really put the work into it?
Yeah, it's interesting because 'tis the season as we're coming up
Hmm.
here on Q4 and getting going with budgets and planning for next year. How much time companies will spend taking a look at what worked this year, and is there changes that are coming up? And I know 5, 6, 7 years ago they do annual plans. I know companies right now that are refining their go-to-market plans every 90 days
Hmm.
based on the pace of competition, based on new entry into the marketplace. You just have to do it on a more succinct and timely basis. So the two slides thrown up at the national sales meeting don't count as a strategy, right? We've had that discussion, you and I,
Sure.
before. They've got to be more specific. They've got to be timely, and it needs to be refined if we're able to help them to execute on the sales process.
Yeah. So before we get into process, what are some of the elements of a good sales strategy that you should consider?
You certainly have to consider who are your customers, John.
Hmm.
Even existing companies, as that changes, they need to know who their customers are. They need to understand the markets that they compete in. You can't be chasing every rabbit that runs across the field. They need to be specific on the markets they compete in, and they need to have a very clear understanding of the value that they bring to those customers in their markets. We'll take it down even further with sales process on that tactical execution, the pieces specifically. But on the strategy end, on the high end, got to make sure we have those three pieces in place.
So, and obviously, buyers are changing a lot, and the
Yep.
market's changing a lot. So, as you mentioned earlier, I can see why some organizations may be reviewing their sales strategy on such a regular basis. And in fact, there's a number of years ago, somebody pointed out to me, which I thought was something that's very profound. Was it's not what you know that gets you into trouble. It's what you think you know that turns out not to be true. And
Yeah.
I found that with working with organizations, that often people go, "Oh yeah, we know who our buyer is," and you go, "Well, when's the last time you've actually done an exercise in really nailing down the characteristics?" And they say, "Well, it's been a while, but we know who our customers are."
Right. Well, and again, 'tis the season right
Hmm.
here for most companies as we go into Q4, as they start planning next year. Even if that customer hasn't purchased something from you this year,
Hmm.
they're up for a renewal, there's a new product that you want to introduce. Sellers want to get back in front of those individuals just to understand what may have changed since the last time the
Right.
buying cycle was executed on, and making sure they understand what their plans are for next year. Because as you mentioned, it will change.
Hmm.
It may change more rapidly than sellers like to recognize, or their managers. So we need to get in front of those individuals now, or I would say even on the key accounts, at least on a quarterly basis, to
Right.
make sure that we understand, because we know that buyers move positions depending on the functional role that they have. People are going to move. And certainly if there's a new player in place, you want to meet them before you come to try and position your product or service.
Absolutely. Okay, so you say you get your sales strategy down and you've done your proper homework and you get it down
Yeah.
properly. Now, as you want to translate this into a functional and well-defined sales process, what are the first steps?
Well, the first steps are to understand how people are buying from you, back to the
Hmm.
comments that we just made. Who are those individuals? What are the activities that they will be taking on as they determine what needs are in the organization? Um, how will they go through and make a purchasing process? How will they go through and actually acquire products or services? So before we get into the selling, and the misnomer is the name sales
Hmm.
process, is we want to make sure that we understand what's happening on the customer or the prospect side to actually procure your product or services.
And one of the things that I've come across a lot in the past is, okay, so you lay out a sales process, but people interpret the stages differently,
Mm-hmm.
right? So
Yeah.
it's obviously very important to define what happens within a stage rather than just be vague
Yes.
about a stage, right?
Yes. So we're defining what happens in the stage for the customer or the prospect first. Then we're going in and saying what are the things that the seller or people who are supporting the seller, technical resource, whatever it might be, should be doing during those stages. And a phrase that you've often used with me, John, are we advancing or are we continuing in stages?
Right.
What's the exit? And the exit has to be agreed from one stage to the next by the prospect or customer. So we'll put those things in, and we don't want it to be burdensome in sales process, like it has to be contractual every time, but we do need to get agreement that we're moving forward, and it's based on the definitions within those stages.
Right. Yeah, no, I totally agree because, yeah, there's nothing more frustrating than people thinking or salespeople thinking that because there's a lot of activity taking place that
Yeah,
a sale is moving forward when in fact you're doing all the activity, the buyer's not doing anything. So in fact the process isn't moving forward at all.
right,
Um,
right.
so I think nowadays, once upon a time, there was, again, I go back to that word lip service. It was somewhat lip service paid to sales process because, you know, people held on to the idea that you kind of let salespeople execute the way they wanted to execute. And, it's nice to have a process, but salespeople are creative and you can't get in the way. I don't think anymore you can really operate without a pretty well defined sales process. And I think the most successful companies have shown us that. Has that been your experience?
It is, John. And there's always the top 10% of sales organizations who know what to do intuitively or on a regular basis.
Hmm.
And they're the peak performers, the A players who do go out and on a regular basis get that done. The concern is when we drop down into the B and C players, the middle of the pack, who think that the world is their canvas and they're the artiste and they make it up and they go through.
Hmm.
And that's where we get into trouble, particularly around end of quarter, end of year, when it's time to tighten down on the forecast and really understand what should be happening in the coming weeks or month.
So, as good as your process can be and as well defined as it can be, the salespeople still need the skills to execute it correctly,
In,
right?
Indeed. So as part of the design, and we've done this many times in a variety of different industries, we're defining what happens in the stages, and then we're aligning the selling skills that sellers and others in customer-facing roles have to master and execute on a regular basis.
Hmm.
What are those skills? And a seller will accelerate to the rate of their weakest skill. In
Right.
other words, in opportunity or account development, if they're not good at getting access to key players, that challenge is going to come up time and time again when we're trying to sell to somebody who's not a decision maker.
Hmm.
So the skills are aligned through those stages. The first line manager, the sales director, the VP, the coaching programs that we give them that visibility in to see where skills might not be fully intact and how to coach the sellers through those stages in a skill-based capacity.
And as we mentioned, then the steps of the process have to be tied to key milestones, right?
Yes.
And they have to be well-defined milestones, and not too many of them either. I mean, I've seen in the past, when people say we have a 15-step sales process, and I'm
Yes.
like, goodness, do you ever sell anything?
Yeah.
That. So how would you advise people when they're looking at how many steps should be in their sales process? How do they focus in on what those key milestones really are?
Yeah, well, I know the number of steps that most of the sellers that I speak to would like to have, and that would be one. But that's
Yeah.
rarely the case, right? That's hardly
Hmm.
ever the case where we
Hmm.
walk in and get a piece of business.
Hmm.
Process fatigue will set in if we get into double digits in the number of steps that we're putting into a sales process. Our recommendation, if there are sub steps, if there are other things that need to be covered off, particularly in a high technology type of sale or a
Right.
sale that needs deep installation, service training, thing like that, that we put sub steps in the macro steps of the sales process. But the vast majority of the companies we work with, John, are going to have 6 or 7
Hmm.
in their sales process. And then there will be other steps, much like on an implementation plan for training or whatever it is, that need to be covered off as they go through those steps. But to put something that has double digits in a CRM and expect the seller to be
Sure.
able to understand that is burdensome, as you know from your business.
Sure. Absolutely. So again, you can get your sales strategy, you can put your sales process in place, you can define it well, you can educate your salespeople on it. But at the end of the day, it really does come down to how the sales manager leverages the sales process with their sales team, right?
Yes, yes. And if we're not coaching to the sales process, if we're not using the vernacular, if we're not making sure that the verifiable outcomes or the tools that we use to help in the training, if those things are not backed up within the CRM and used on a regular coaching basis, you're going to have variation. It's going to be
Hmm.
all over the page. If you have 50 sellers, you might have 50 different ways. So, yes, we got to make sure that the coaching is done on a regular basis, regular intervals. Critical component, John. Many managers are deal coaches where they're coming
Hmm.
in and orchestrating the product or service mix that should be in. We got to make sure that our managers are skill coaches as well,
Yeah.
because that's the part where the development can accelerate or the development can stagnate or slide backwards. So critical to have the skill piece as well.
Yeah, because otherwise we have the temptation where the sales manager focuses late in the pipeline, right? Late in the
Yes,
sales process. And as you
yes,
say, it starts to take on the super closer role,
yeah,
which
yeah.
doesn't, which may get some deals done, but doesn't ultimately, doesn't add value really, and doesn't help develop the salesperson either, right?
Yeah, if we're waiting for somebody to parachute in on the Hail Mary or the fire drill, there's generally not a whole lot of learning going on there. I
Mhm.
know it will still happen in certain circumstances, but if we're not coaching that seller to fish on their own, we're really creating some dangerous habits there.
Yeah. And one of the things we focus on a lot in Pipeline or CRM is the idea of leading indicators. And it's something you mentioned here, because a lot of times people will, in sales management particularly, will look at lagging indicators, right? They'll look at
Yeah.
revenue results and then they'll try and gain some insight from that, which is legitimate. And,
Yes.
and you should be doing that, obviously. But you can't impact a deal that's either lost or a sale that you sold for half of what you should have sold,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
So
Correct.
talk a little bit about leading indicators, because that's where the power really comes in, when you can right the ship before it
Yes.
hits
Yes.
the
Well,
iceberg.
yeah, and the proverbial metaphor is: are we driving looking in the rearview mirror, or
Yeah,
are we
right.
driving looking out the windshield?
Hmm.
And what's coming? And do you have actual benchmarks, numbers that go in that talk about the number of opportunities that should be in the pipeline overall, the total volume of the opportunities in terms of numbers and dollars or whatever the currency is? The second one would be: what are the size of those opportunities that are going through? And then third, what's the velocity? How long is it taking opportunities to go through? Transactional pieces might go through in a few days. The enterprise B2B sale could take months or a year, year and a half, whatever the case is. But within the stages, John, as you know, there's
Hmm.
also pieces that are in there, the leading indicators that opportunities are moving. And that's
Right.
the confirmation with the customer or the prospect as they go through, that they are moving through those gates within a reasonable time frame, that we're not just sitting in that evaluation forever, waiting for the end of the quarter or month to come for the ultimate beat up type of negotiation. So, sales process and the tools and the verifiable outcomes will show you when those things should be happening. And we're not saying because it's in, the buyer will always cooperate,
Sure.
because you and I both know that's not the
Hmm.
case. but you will get an understanding of what the benchmark should be, what the healthy overall revenue pipeline looks like, and we help our customers to create and interpret and continue to refine that to increase some predictability.
And I think on that note of predictability, I think that's a key point to stress as well, because what is the one of the biggest complaints you hear in any organization, and that's forecasting, right? The forecasts are off. You
Yeah,
promised
yeah,
me X amount last month and you delivered, X minus 1,000% or whatever
yes,
it is. But to forecast in any predictable or semi-accurate way, you have to have these leading indicators in place. So,
do.
in your experience, is there a direct correlation between having a good sales process and executing a good sales process and being able to forecast or predict revenue?
Well, there is, but it goes back to our comment earlier. Do we have a good understanding of the definition of what's going on in each of those stages? Do we agree to that? And
Hmm.
I'm not saying 100% of the
Sure.
time, 100% of the opportunities, but within reason. Because if we don't have that benchmark, if we don't have that understanding across the organization, there's always going to be exceptions. It's management by exception where this deal,
Hmm.
this opportunity is different. So the forecasting inaccuracy comes in when things are skipped, generally when opportunities or stages are skipped going through, and the seller is then trying to convince their manager of why that is the exception.
Hmm.
Where we don't get approval and understanding from the buyer that we're moving to the next stage, and we move it up to the next stage and then artificially try to create something that's going to happen without any reason for doing so. And I want to make a comment here that just because we have those stages in, John, on a regular basis with definition and verifiable outcomes, sales process is not always linear.
Sure.
Life is not always linear.
Hmm.
I have two teenagers, and I understand that it's not. So sometimes we're going to move around when we have multiple key players going in to make a selection. We're going to be in different places during that sales opportunity,
Hmm.
during that opportunity development. But we got to rely on the process as a way to gauge progress moving forward. I mean, if we're making exceptions all the time, the forecast is going to be a mess.
No, absolutely. Then the exceptions become the rule, and then everything's a mess, and then you have your sales process sitting in your CRM system being ignored by everybody, right? Could you give some practical advice to anybody, say a sales manager who's watching this today? What should he do about his sales process in terms of going back and looking at it and seeing if it really is the way it should be right now?
Well, there's a simple way to do this, John, and this is to ask a customer who you have a good relationship with trust and rapport, to explain to them, to explain to the manager, how did they go through the process of selecting his or her organization?
Mm-hmm.
And then let's just take a look and see if that matches up. Now, I could ask salespeople how it worked,
Sure.
but I want to make sure I understand it from the perspective of the person who actually did the selection.
Mm-hmm.
So that's one way that I encourage them to do it. They could take a look at the time and date stamp. When is the last time we updated our sales process to make sure
Yeah.
it's accurately reflecting? People will naturally do this when they're releasing a new product,
Sure.
when they acquire another company. I have two
Mm.
customers from this year who recently, one was acquired, one went out and bought another company. So they're refining what they're doing because their service offering, product offering is going to change. And then if the competition comes in, and or they're going into a new market. So there are a few areas that will naturally get people to begin to think about, hey, do we have the right processes, steps in place here?
Mm-hmm. So, and then the other part of all of this, obviously, is, as you mentioned earlier, there are indicators there you can look at. If you measure velocity, and the velocity of opportunities in various stages wildly fluctuates, it's
Yeah.
probably a good indication that salespeople are interpreting those stages differently.
Yes, they're interpreting those stages differently, and or the customer will oftentimes, customer or prospect, move
Mm-hmm.
through a stage more quickly or slowly than others.
Right.
So it would help to understand from the manager during the debrief of the opportunity with the salesperson, why did that go so quickly? Not that that's a bad thing, that's
No,
a good
it's a
thing.
great
Or,
thing.
right, or why did it take so long? So if we understand those anomalies, we can make course corrections.
Yeah.
But if we're just relying on some dated, stagnant type of information, we're not going to get the accuracy that we're looking for. But I encourage any sales manager out there, find a customer or two. There's many out there who like you and have bought from you before. Get in front of them and ask them and tell them why you want to make sure that it's accurate.
Right.
So if the next time they come to you, you understand what's important to them and how things could flow.
No, I think that's a great piece of advice. And the other great piece of advice coming out of this, I think, is, well, there's a couple. There's get your sales strategy right first, then get your sales process. And then remember, sales process and sales strategy are dynamic. The days of being able to put together here's our 5-year plan.
Right.
It's more like, here's our 5-month or here's our 5-day plan.
Yeah. It's moving at warp speed. It's not going to slow down anytime soon. Mm-hmm. And I think in understanding previous comment, it's not linear. It's not static. It's going to change. I'm not going to suggest that a seller, when a customer or prospect says on stage 2 that they're ready to buy, they slow them down and go through the next 4 steps. We want to make sure that they understand the value proposition, the understanding of what a good implementation or installation of your product or service looks like. Then we're ready to move forward.
Absolutely. All right, John, listen, this has been great. So before we go, could you just spend a couple of moments telling everybody a little bit more about yourself, about your organization, and how they can contact you?
Yeah, thanks so much. Well, you mentioned at the beginning, it's drive-revenue.com is our website. The company name is Flannery Sales Systems. We've been doing this for 12 and a half years and working with companies in a variety of different industries, manufacturing, medical device, professional services. We've worked in 16 countries, John, to include Asia, Europe, Australia, and all throughout North America. We're a small shop. We only have 3 or 4 customers at a time, and we provide a customized approach to the development and implementation of sales process. So it's not just methodology. We're going in and making sure that the sales process accurately reflects the things that you and I were talking about today, the markets you compete in, how your product or service creates value. We take a thorough approach to making sure we get it right before we put anybody into a program. And then the key component to our success is the implementation plan. After the people in customer-facing roles are trained, what's going to happen when they walk into the field? We want to make sure we have a clear understanding of that with management and senior leadership before we begin any project. It's the key to success.
Right. And so drive-revenue.com is where they can find you.
That's correct. Flannery Sales Systems.
Perfect. All right. Again, I'd like to thank John Flannery from Flannery Sales Systems for joining us today. My name is John Golden. This is another expert interview from SalesPOP Online Sales Magazine and Pipeliner CRM, and we'll see you all again soon. Thank you.
Thanks, John. Take care.